Why Vietnam is forever stuck between Southeast Asia and East Asia. The question sounds simple. Why do some Vietnamese people want to be seen as East Asian instead of Southeast Asian? But the moment you ask it, you realize you are walking into one of the most complicated identity debates in Asia, because Vietnam is one of those countries that refuses to fit neatly into a single box. Geographically, Southeast Asia; historically, deeply connected to the Sinosphere; linguistically, Austroasiatic; religiously, a mixture of indigenous beliefs, Chinese traditions, and Buddhist influences; politically, a member of ASEAN; culturally, something uniquely Vietnamese. And that is exactly why this debate exists. Vietnam sits at a crossroads, not just physically, civilizationally. Imagine you are looking at Asia from above. You see the continent divided into regions: China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia. Everything looks simple: borders, maps, labels. But then you zoom in. You notice something. Human civilization does not follow straight lines. Culture does not stop at a mountain range. Languages cross borders, religions travel, empires expand, people migrate, ideas move. The map is clean, history is messy. Vietnam is a perfect example of that mess. The first thing to understand is this: Vietnamese people are not confused because they are ignorant of their own history. Many are actually very aware of it. A Vietnamese person who says Vietnam has East Asian cultural influence is usually not saying Vietnam is China. Those are two completely different statements. Influence is not identity. Nobody says Japan is Chinese because Japan uses kanji. Nobody says Korea is Chinese because Korea historically used Chinese characters. Nobody says England is Italian because the Romans left roads, laws, and vocabulary behind. Civilizations borrow from stronger neighbors. That is how human history works. For Vietnam, the strongest historical influence came from China. This is the foundation of the argument. For roughly a millennium, northern Vietnam was under Chinese rule. That period shaped Vietnamese state formation, government structures, education, writing systems, philosophy, political organization, elite culture. This was not a minor influence. It was foundational. Before modern Vietnamese nationalism existed, educated elites operated inside a world heavily influenced by classical Chinese civilization. Officials studied Chinese texts. Government exams followed Chinese models. Confucian philosophy shaped social expectations. Literature was written in classical Chinese. The Vietnamese court often modeled itself after Chinese imperial institutions. A person from medieval Vietnam would have recognized many similarities with other Confucian societies, especially in the world of scholars and government. This is why the term Sinosphere exists. The Sinosphere is not saying everyone inside this sphere is Chinese. That would be ridiculous. It simply means these societies were historically influenced by Chinese civilization. A sphere of influence, a cultural network, a historical relationship. Vietnam was one of the most southern members of that world. But here is where the debate becomes complicated. Because Vietnam did not just absorb Chinese influence, Vietnam also resisted China. This is one of the most important parts people forget. Vietnamese history contains both admiration and opposition toward China. The relationship is complicated. China was a source of culture, technology, philosophy, and political models. China was also a powerful neighbor that repeatedly threatened Vietnamese independence. Both things are true. History is rarely a simple love story or hate story. This creates a unique Vietnamese identity. A Vietnamese person could simultaneously say, "We inherited many things from Chinese civilization, and we are not Chinese." Those statements do not contradict each other. In fact, that tension is part of Vietnamese history. Now compare Vietnam with other Southeast Asian countries. This is where many Vietnamese notice differences: Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. These societies developed under different historical influences. Many mainland Southeast Asian kingdoms were deeply connected to Indian civilization, Hindu concepts of kingship, Sanskrit, Pali, Theravada Buddhism, Indian religious literature, Indian artistic traditions. Maritime Southeast Asia developed through different networks: Islamic trade routes, Austronesian migrations, European colonial influences. Vietnam's historical path was different. This does not mean Vietnam is less Southeast Asian. That idea is too simplistic. Vietnam has enormous Southeast Asian characteristics: the food, the climate, the agricultural traditions. The village structure, the wet rice culture, the regional trade connections, the influence from neighboring peoples, the history of Champa, the history of Khmer-Vietnamese interaction, the Mekong Delta, the tropical lifestyle of the South. Vietnam is not some foreign object placed inside Southeast Asia. It is one of Southeast Asia's oldest civilizations. The real argument is not, is Vietnam Southeast Asian? Yes, it is. The real argument is Vietnam culturally closer to some East Asian societies than some Southeast Asian societies in certain areas? That is a much more complicated question, and sometimes the answer is yes. Take family values. Many Vietnamese families emphasize respect for parents, education, academic achievement, family reputation, filial responsibility, ancestor worship. These values are often associated with Confucian societies. You can find similar attitudes in China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore's Chinese communities. Of course, each society expresses them differently, but the similarities are noticeable. Now take cuisine. Vietnamese cuisine is obviously Southeast Asian. Fish sauce, fresh herbs, tropical ingredients, rice culture. But it also shares certain patterns with the Sinosphere. Chopsticks, soup traditions, tea culture, certain cooking techniques, festival foods, Lunar New Year traditions, again, mixed heritage, not one side, both sides. Language creates another interesting situation. A foreigner hearing Vietnamese may not realize how much Chinese influence exists beneath the surface. Vietnamese vocabulary contains a massive amount of Sino-Vietnamese words, especially in formal contexts. Politics, science, philosophy, education, government, medicine, literature, law. Many advanced concepts entered Vietnamese through Chinese. However, the foundation of the Vietnamese language itself is not Chinese. Vietnamese is Austroasiatic, related to Khmer. This creates a fascinating contradiction. The structure of the language says one thing, the vocabulary says another. That is what happens when cultures interact for centuries. Now comes the uncomfortable part. Economics. Because identity is not only about history, it is also about status. People do not like admitting this, but countries are judged by prestige. When people say East Asia, many outsiders immediately think Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China's economic centers, technology, universities, companies, modern infrastructure. When people say Southeast Asia, many outsiders still have outdated images. Tourism, cheap labor, developing economies, political instability. These stereotypes are unfair, but perception affects identity. Humans naturally want to associate themselves with groups they admire. This is not unique to Vietnam. A country becoming wealthier often changes how it presents itself. Look at Japan during the Meiji period. Japan aggressively presented itself as modern and separate from its Asian neighbors. Look at South Korea today. Its global image has transformed dramatically. Look at Singapore. Its identity is constantly negotiated between Southeast Asian geography and global economic positioning. National identity is not frozen. It evolves. Vietnam is experiencing something similar. As Vietnam develops economically, more people are reconsidering how they see themselves. Some emphasize Southeast Asian identity, ASEAN cooperation, regional connections. Others emphasize the Sinosphere, historical civilization, cultural similarities with China, Korea, and Japan. Both narratives exist. There is also a psychological element. For centuries, Vietnam existed next to a giant neighbor, China, a civilization historically larger, richer, and more powerful. Vietnam had to define itself against China. This created a strange relationship, admiration, competition, resistance, borrowing, separation, all at once. A smaller civilization often becomes highly conscious of its identity. This is why Vietnamese nationalism developed differently from some other countries. Vietnamese identity was never simply, we are different because we have no connection. It was often, we are different despite having deep connections. That is a much more complicated identity. Now let's talk about the inner version of this debate. Online, everything becomes extreme. One person says, Vietnam is basically East Asian. Another says, Vietnam has nothing to do with East Asia. Both are oversimplifications. The first ignores geography and Southeast Asian connections. The second ignores 1,000 years of historical interaction. Reality sits between them. Usually, reality lives in the uncomfortable middle. The truth is Vietnam is one of the most interesting cultural crossroads in Asia. A country where Chinese characters once dominated elite writing, but a Latin alphabet now represents the language. A country where Confucian values shape society, but tropical Southeast Asian traditions shape daily life. A country where Buddhism came through China, but local beliefs remained powerful. A country where northern Vietnam feels historically closer to the Sinosphere, while southern Vietnam has stronger connections with maritime Southeast Asia. A country where Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City can sometimes feel like two different worlds. Maybe the question should not be, is Vietnam East Asian or Southeast Asian? Because that assumes identity is a competition, like choosing a team. But cultures are not sports teams. You don't have to pick one. A person can have multiple identities. A country can have multiple influences. A civilization can sit at the intersection of different worlds. Vietnam is not an outsider trying to enter East Asia, nor is it simply another copy of its Southeast Asian neighbors. It is Vietnam, a civilization shaped by the meeting point between two worlds, the Chinese world to the north, the Southeast Asian world around it. And after centuries of borrowing, resisting, adapting, and transforming, it became something that belongs completely to neither side and completely to both.